All right, we've started our blank project and we're getting ready to get started building. The first thing I like to do in this video is correct a misstatement I made in the end of the previous one. I said that a skybox would be included in starter content, which they are clearly not. This skybox came with our blank project that does not include starter content, so I stand corrected. The sky sphere is an asset that's included with the engine and will run by default in any blank levels that you create. So that's kind of a nice place to start, though. I'm not going to delete it because it does serve a pretty decent purpose as we start prototyping the layout of our level. Before we get started going over the user interface of Unreal Engine, I did want to mention that this sort of the exposition parts of these videos is not intended to be completely thorough. It's not intended to be a full instructional guide. I am going to be focused on teaching for function, so as not to waste any time. And in the spirit of not wasting time, let's go ahead and get started. When you boot up Unreal Engine 4 and open up a blank project, the first thing you're going to notice is this big pane of glass here in the middle of your screen through which you look out into your game project. This is the viewport. You have a lot of options in terms of how it behaves and how you interact with items in the viewport. Across the top here, and then the actual controls to navigate around your game environment in the viewport are fairly simple. If you right click and hold, your WASD keys will move you laterally in every direction. If you aren't pressing right click, those keys do nothing. You can zoom in by scroll wheel up and zoom out via scroll wheel down. If you left click any item in the viewport, you're going to select that item. And as I'm selecting these items, you will see that they become highlighted over here in the World Outliner. This is going to give you a list of all of the objects that are located in your game world, or in that particular level that you have loaded in the viewport here. As I select different items in the viewport, you're going to see down here the details pane. And the details pane is populated with the detailed information about any particular object that you have in your game mode, in your game world. And you can see as I'm selecting different things, we have different sets of details. This down here is also extremely important to know off the get-go. This is the content browser. Any files that are associated with your game at all are going to be located down here. And as you can see, we started with a blank game, and so we have no content in our content browser. We're going to fix that in just a little while. And then up here, this is sort of the command interface. You can actually change how you're interacting with the viewport using these different modes here. And so this is a good place to start, this place mode. This will give you different types of geometry or different types of objects that you can place in your game. So to get started, let's focus on what we're going to build. So the first thing that we're going to want to get started with is we're going to need something that the players can control. I would suggest let's start with something simple like a cube. All right, this is going to be a 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter cube. And we're going to use this as a basis to create a player controllable object. And in Unreal Engine, and this is specific to Unreal Engine, players and AI, for that matter, control objects called pawns. Pawns are they are represented in the world by some 3D object called a mesh, and the mesh is going to be your 3D sculpture or your art asset that will represent that particular pawn. Pawns have what's called a movement component to them, so that is what tells the Unreal Engine back end how to, like if for example, if an AI is controlling a pawn, it's going to use the pawn's movement component to actually make the movement that it wants to make. If a player is, for example, doing some kind of input, the pawn will interpret that input through its movement component, and then it will output by actually moving the player's pawn around in the game world. So we need to create ourselves a pawn. given that this is going to be a game where players are going to be playing against each other and they're going to be playing as hovercrafts, and given that I'm not an artist, we're going to start by making a pawn out of basic geometry, and then later we will replace the basic geometry with more advanced geometry. It's not a gameplay necessary thing to create our finalized game model up front. We can do that later. So let's right-click down here in the content browser, and when you right-click, you're going to get the right-click menu. Take a look at this new asset here, and we're going to create a new blueprint class. You can see there's a few other options. I'll just go over them briefly. You can create a new level, a new material, and materials are added to 3D models to actually, it's kind of like painting them, but it's actually more than just paint. It's all of their visual representation. Or you can add a new particle system. And in fact, you can create advanced assets, and basically you can create a new version of just about any type of asset that Unreal Engine understands just through this right-click menu right here. But to get started, we're going to get started by making a blueprint class. You can read the tooltip if you want a detailed explanation of what blueprints are. But the best way to think about blueprints is blueprints are a package that can include assets like 3D models and materials, movement components like a pawn does, and you can also, probably most importantly, add instructions for the game to interpret inputs, and sort of you can add your game logic to blueprints, and that's why they're so special. So blueprints are going to be where we spend the majority of our time in Unreal Engine actually editing the game, creating gameplay. So let's get started by adding a blueprint, and then when we click this, it's going to ask us what kind of blueprint we want to make. And the way that it asks us this is it says to pick the parent class. I do want to mention very briefly that classes are a very extremely important concept for Unreal Engine. If you are familiar with object-oriented design, object-oriented programming, then there's you already know what classes are and you understand inheritance and all of that. If you don't have a background with object-oriented programming, just know that a class is sort of like a category, and all classes have a parent. And when you create a new class, you can create a new class based on a previously existing class. So for example, an actor is going to be the most, what's the word I'm looking for? It is the most abstract type of blueprint that you can create. It's an object that can be placed or spawned in the world. Very, very simple in terms of functionality, but very lightweight. It doesn't have a lot of data that is included with it. A pawn is a type of actor. So every variable category that actor has, like location, rotation, scale, tags, all the functionality that an actor has, a pawn also has. But in addition to all of the actor's functionality and data that comes with it, the pawn can be possessed by a controller and receive input. And so that is the most basic type of object in the Unreal Engine that can actually receive input and interpret it into some sort of behavior. You also have character. A character is a kind of pawn that includes the ability to walk around. Now, our hovercrafts don't need to walk around, so we don't need a character. We want a pawn. In terms of best practice, it is always best to pick the most basic parent class that you can and still achieve the functionality that you want, because any more specific, if I was to make this hovercraft out of the character, at best we're going to be including unnecessary bloat in our game, because it's going to have options for animation and things like that that we're not going to use. And at worst, we can actually break our game by trying to interface with just the pawn level data when we actually have a character instead. So it's always the best practice to use the most basic blueprint class possible when we're creating a new blueprint. So in this case, pawn. And you always start by naming your new asset. I'm going to name this PC for player character hovercraft. All right. And so it gives you a nice little pawn icon, since that's a pawn blueprint. When I open this, I get the blueprint editor environment. Now it's got some similarities to the overall level editor in Unreal Engine that opened up when we started Unreal Engine, in that you have a viewport here in the middle, and that's showing you what your pawn looks like. Over here on the left we have the it's kind of the same as the world outliner. It's the blueprint outliner. You've got all of the components of your blueprint over here. So that would be like we can add cameras, lights, meshes, those types of things. This is sort of like the content browser for your blueprint. Any of the variables that your blueprint needs to keep track of, the components. This is a reference to the components up here. That becomes important a little bit later when we start editing the blueprints. And then the different graphs that map out what the blueprint logic we've created are over here. And then this is the details panel. So any of the components that you might add here, as you select different components, you're going to get different sets of details for each one of those components. And you can edit the default values and sort of how they behave here in the details section. So to get started with our pawn, oh, and I forgot to mention the controls in this viewport are the exact same as the controls in the main level viewport. So very easy to navigate around in here. So we want to get started by actually having sort of a physical representation of our players in the world, right? So we're going to add a component up here to our pawn blueprint. And the component that we're going to add is going to be something very easy. We want to add a static mesh component. Boom. And we're going to rename that static mesh, we're just going to name it body. It's kind of like a car body. Just something very simple, something easy for us to remember, that this is where we're storing the actual, aesthetic appearance of our vehicle. And also, this is going to be responsible for generating collision as well, at least in the beginning. So it's important that we remember that too. Now I'm going to do something that's maybe not very intuitive right now, but it will simplify things as we go along. I'm actually going to drag and drop this body onto the item here called default scene root. What's going to happen is this is going to make the body of our vehicle the new root. The important thing about this is that now I do not have any I don't have any separation between the body and a reference to the blueprint itself. As we move this body around, the blueprint is going to move with it, and all of the components are going to be moving along with it as well. You can achieve a similar effect by parenting additional components to the body, but this just simplifies in terms of concept. Later on, when we go about starting to modify individual components in our event graph, this will make it a little bit easier conceptually. So we're going to have the body as our base root. Now, we want to add a static mesh to our body so that it actually will become visible. As you can see, there's nothing there right now. Oh, but look, we don't have any static meshes to use. So this is a good time to pause, and we will reconvene in the next video, where we're going to learn how to import a static mesh and set the body component to be our static mesh.